Hi, Dan.
Hey Rachel, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I'm so glad we're doing this.
Me too. We had so many great questions this month, so I'm excited to get to a few more.
Yeah, I feel the same way. We never get through all of them, but it's nice to be able to at least get a few more in. So I'm ready whenever you are.
Okay, well, our first question is it politically possible for Biden to add four justices to the US Supreme Court and propose Kamala Harris for a seat, giving him a new vice president like Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer?
Uh, it's constitutionally possible. It's politically difficult. For those of you with long memories or who've studied history, you may remember how much political trouble Franklin Roosevelt got in back in his term in office when he tried to add seats to the Supreme Court to thwart a court that he thought was unduly conservative. He was accused of court packing, backed off pretty quickly, and that was the end of that. And so while there are some voices in the Democratic Party that are urging Biden to go in that direction, I think it's pretty unlikely. As far as appointing Harris to the court, I think that's something that might have been a possibility for Biden early in his term, because had he done that in the first year or two of his term, Vice President Harris, would have stepped down from the vice presidency in order to make history as the nation's first Black female justice. Um, since Biden nominated Justice Jackson, since then, the same level of historical import would not necessarily carry. So Biden, who very badly needs to motivate his base in order to win re-election, and who knows that there is no more important part of his base than Black women, and also understands that to ask Harris to leave the ticket, even for a seat on the Supreme Court, could discourage those voters who've been some of his most loyal supporters in the past. I don't think it's a risk that Biden is willing to run, and particularly at a time when the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade has become such a seminal point of debate in this campaign. Harris actually has become a very effective spokesperson for the administration and for the ticket on these issues. And so while she certainly raised some concerns early in her term, and there's still no doubt a certain number of Democrats who worry about her place on the ticket, it does appear at least that she's becoming more of an asset to Biden than she has in the past, primarily because of the import of the abortion rights discussion.
And for our next question, aren't the congressional and senatorial elections in November equally important as the presidential election, given that either president would have to deal with the legislative branches?
Well, it's a great question, Katie, and we should please let our questioner know how smart they are to be paying attention to the congressional races too. The presidential campaign, as we all know, gets an overwhelming majority of public and media attention. But of course, there are three co-equal branches of government. And as most of you know, Congress, the legislative branch, not the president and the executive branch, are the first mentioned in the Constitution. Because the margins in both the House and the Senate are so tight, Republicans control the House of Representatives by just a couple of seats at this point, and Democrats have just a single one-seat majority in the Senate. Both chambers have majorities at stake in the fall. If the next president were to have Congress as congressional majorities in his party, either Biden or Trump, then that president would be in a position to get much, much more done. If one or both of those chambers opposes the president, it becomes much more difficult. Right now, both are on a razor's edge, and it's almost impossible to predict when the margins are so close. But people who watch these races seat by seat very closely believe that simply because of the seats that Republicans have won in the past that were carried by Biden, and the number of Democratic incumbents in the Senate that are up for re-election, they believe that the most likely outcome is that the two majorities simply switch, and that a Republican House majority turns over to the Democrats, and a Democratic Senate majority turns over to the Republicans. Now, that's certainly not a prediction 9 months before the election, but when the margins are that close, that's how difficult it is to predict. But no question, the outcome of those races and those majorities are just as important as the presidential election.
And then for our final question, who would China, Russia, the EU, and Japan each vote for in the presidential elections if they could?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. And I would say we'll start with the easiest of them from any number of news articles that have been written and broadcast over the months. It appears that European leaders are more comfortable with the Biden administration than the Trump administration, simply because they know that Biden is more committed not only to an international approach from the US's perspective, but a multilateral approach, working closely with its allies, whereas Trump tends to be a bit more go at it alone in his international dealings. After that, it gets a little bit tricky. Vladimir Putin and Trump are known to have a fairly close relationship. And so some might guess that Putin in Russia, therefore, would prefer Trump as president. And the most intriguing of all of them is China. I saw a Chinese diplomat quoted not too recently talking about how objectionable he finds both of these men for very different reasons. And so I think, and this is a pure guess, there's really no way to know. I suspect China would probably rather have Biden as president, not necessarily because they are closer to him on policy, but because they find him to be a more reliable and a more consistent partner with which to work. Now, of course, Trump would take that and attempt to turn it into an advantage for himself, talking to an electorate in which increasingly Republican and Democratic voters alike are increasingly more and more suspicious of China. And so Trump being able to say, well, the Chinese would rather have Biden, well, that's a political benefit for me. So when push comes to shove, it's fun to guess about these types of things. There's no way to know for sure. What I will say, though, is that the biggest difference between the two of them on an international stage is that while Biden has become much more resistant to further economic trade agreements with other countries than previous Democratic presidents, Obama and Clinton and others, that on balance, we do tend to see more isolationist tendencies from Trump and his supporters than from Biden. These are trends that are growing in both directions. Our country is turning inward on both the left and the right. But Biden, I think just by virtue of his political biography being born in the Cold War, is probably somewhat more committed to maintaining the US's international presence on the world stage. And some of our allies like that, some of our foes, not so much.
Really interesting question and answer, Dan. Thank you. And thank you again for taking the time to record this. I know we love having additional conversations about all the great questions that we get during the month. So thanks so much for that.
No, as always, Rachel, thank you and thank Katie. Both of you do terrific work, not just on these continuing the conversations, but on the webinars themselves the first week of every month. And I know we'll be gathering again with our group at the beginning of March. And of course, the neat thing about that program is it's going to take place immediately adjacent, not just to the California primaries, but to the Super Tuesday elections on March 5th across the country, where no fewer than 16 states are going to be voting in presidential primaries. So I have no doubt there'll be a lot to talk about in March and going forward throughout the year.
Yeah, can't wait. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Have a great night, both of you, and I'll look forward to talking again soon.